Life is something that everybody wants to be absolutely perfect and nice all the time. Sometimes it has cracks. When we listened on the 10th day that the search had been abandoned, she says, we are dead, we are condemned, we are going to die, and this is going to be horrible. Starvation, cold, fear, what could happen? This is going to be hell. From the outside, it looks like courage. I never thought about the word courage there. Every time through that trek, every day, every night, I say, how am I going to die? The only question was, how will I meet my death? So I looked to the mountains and I said, I'm going to die, but I'm going to die fighting.
Hello and welcome to Talking Murder Podcast. We're back once again with a huge case, a tragic case, but a case that also gives you hope in the human spirit, I would say. Ben Carter, how are you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. We're blitzing through the series now. Wow, 8 down, 4 to go. But yeah, you're absolutely right. This is a case unlike any other we've covered previously. One of tremendous courage and bravery, but also one of absolute relentless nightmare fuel. And tragedy, as you said. How are we? The man with the mustache, the man with the Mustang. He drives a producer Dan.
Yes, thank you, Ben. Very good, thanks for asking. I've wrapped up warm for today's episode. Mm-hmm. In my itchy, scratchy blanket. Very excited to get into today's case. It's I like snow. I like planes.
I like trains.
I obviously don't like catastrophes, but yeah, very, very intrigued. I hope you boys are feeling wonderful.
As Ben said, this is a case like none that we've ever covered before. It's one that we've spoken about in previous occasions, one that we've always wanted to cover. It's got so much to it. I think, when you read the headlines of it, you kind of get a picture in your head of... It's very dehumanizing when you see the headline of it. You don't think of the people themselves being there, what they went through. And there's so much to this. And there's so much to, yeah, as we said, like just the how quickly they could think on their feet, the things they thought of with no experience, in survival situations like this. Yeah, it's truly a fascinating one. I think you guys are going to find it truly, truly unbelievable, as we did.
Yeah, we've talked about cases before. I think we've used the exact phrase, it just kept getting worse, or this one just keeps getting worse. And that is very relevant in this particular case. It seemed like everything in this situation was against these poor people, the ones that survived and the ones that didn't. And as Tom said, there are lots of layers to this case, including an unbelievable survival journey at the end. So loads to get into.
But Ben, let's tell the audience what this case is.
So this week, Series 12, Episode 8, The Tragedy of the Andes. Also referred to as Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, The Miracle of the Andes, the 1972 Andes Flight Disaster, Society of the Snow, the case behind 1993's Alive, 72 Days of Terror, the surviving 16, and Humanity's Last Resort, Cannibalism on the Mountain. Now, we've learned a new word this week, which we'll chat about in the timeline. New word. I don't know if it's a word I'm going to use that often in life, but it's a new word. For those watching chronologically,
stay tuned for that.
Yeah, the cryptic clue. That's a really sad Warhol painting. Warhol Andy. Oh, that painting's sad and tragic. Tragic on the Andes. Tragedy on the Andes.
Yeah.
Which is good stuff, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there's been some hit and misses with the cryptic clues. But Dan, could you possibly set the scene for us?
I would say more hits than misses so far. But
Yeah,
still
long
time.
way to go. Long way to go. You peak too early, Ben. You've been told before, don't peak too early, because then you fizzle.
Friday 13th of October 1972, the Andes mountain range, approximately 3:30 p.m. Deep within the frozen silence of the Andes, a roar of a plane's engine suddenly cuts through the atmosphere as it turned into a haunting scream. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, carrying 45 people, was now fighting a losing battle against altitude, the elements, and pilot competency. The plane was no longer safely gliding above the clouds, and was instead plummeting into the heart of the mountains. As moments of clearer visibility finally arrived, it became terrifyingly apparent that the plane was flying far too low, and that the plane was now heading straight towards the vast blackness of a very hungry-looking mountain ridge. But it was now far too late, and the fates of 45 people were sealed within just a few seconds. The plane struck the mountaintop at least 2 separate times, removing the right wing and tail section in the process, before the remainder of the aircraft was violently thrown several hundred metres down into a snowy glacier below. Metal tore apart like paper. Part of the baggage hold was ripped from the ceiling. Ice and jagged rock swallowed the fuselage as much of it shattered on impact. The propellers and left wing were also violently removed during the crash. As well as this, 5 people were scattered from the now exposed tail section, all before the wreck came to a very sudden and aggressive stop. The abrupt stop was met with so much force that multiple rows of seats detached from the floor and were hurled towards the cockpit, together with many of the survivors, resulting in the crushing of both pilots, with one being killed instantly. Against all odds, dozens of seriously injured people opened their eyes to find themselves somehow alive in their new reality, now stranded and trapped dozens of miles into one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. And for those poor souls fortunate enough to have survived, the nightmare was only just beginning.
How did 16 individuals manage to survive for 72 days high up in the frozen Andes mountain range with extremely limited food, clothing, shelter, medical aid, fire, and supplies? Why did multiple search planes fail to locate the wreckage even when they flew directly over it on numerous occasions? When did families of the dead, as well as the general public, first start to learn about potential acts of cannibalism up in the mountains? And what ethical debates later arose from their method of survival after their discovery? Was it purely survival instinct, or had the men crossed a clear moral line?
So before we move into our timeline of events for what has been described as one of the world's most devastating and unbelievable stories of survival in history, we're going to first explore how Flight 571 came to be, as well as some of the fears voiced about the plane prior to its takeoff.
So yeah, the background of this as well, not often touched on in some of the documentaries and films out there, but as with any case, with most cases we've covered, there are always so many warning signs, aren't there? And the stats around this one, Dan, as a guy you've played Flight Simulator and stuff, I think you'd be staggered by the stats.
Looking forward to the stats, if anything, yeah.
Oh, let's begin.
Please.
During the spring of 1972, a highly successful amateur rugby union team called Old Christians Club, who were based in the city of Montevideo, Uruguay, were set to compete in a match more than 1,000 miles away in Santiago, Chile. This was in order to play against one of their main rivals, the Old Boys Club, which was a British-founded rugby team based in Chile. At the time that we're sat here recording this episode in the comfort of our own homes, this journey can be completed via car or bus, which would take around 23 hours, and this is predominantly due to the opening of the Cristo Redentor Tunnel. Sorry for the accent there, lack of accent. Also referred to, or in English, Christ the Redeemer Tunnel, and this was built on Chile Route 60 in 1980. The tunnel serves as a crucial international passage connecting Chile with Argentina. However, as the flight only takes 2.5 hours, this is, and was back in the 70s, a much more popular method of completing the journey. And it's actually the second time we've ever kind of touched on the Montevideo area of Uruguay. Ricardo Lopez, Bjork Stalker, born in that city. It's good to be back.
Yeah. I'd like to be back in nicer circumstances for both of those reasons.
Sure. So as the rugby team was an amateur club, chartering a flight for the full team, as well as its coaches, staff members and their friends and family, was not a cheap or straightforward task. So the club president, a man by the name of Daniel Juan, made the decision to instead charter a small plane via the Uruguayan Air Force, and this was in a bid to lower the costs. Apparently, this wasn't really out of the ordinary for the time. The plane provided to them was a Fairchild Hiller FH227D, with the registration, or the now infamous registration, of T571. A twin turboprop aircraft that could accommodate between 44 to 54 passengers and crew. The plane had accumulated 792 hours of flight time during the 4 years since it was built. The initial plan was to fly direct from Montevideo to Santiago, which included a short crossing over the Andes mountain range before arriving at their destination. The plane itself had the unfortunate nickname of the Lead Sled, which had been given to it by a number of different pilots, which was apparently due to its lack of power. Yeah, the Lead Sled. It's not great. Trying to immediately think of a cool nickname for a plane, but Sparky? Probably not, actually.
The High Flyer?
The High Flyer is great. Knew you'd have a good one.
The guaranteed to get you there in one piece plane.
Yeah.
You can never guarantee that.
Yeah, like the Unsinkable, I guess now.
Yeah. Sorry, continue.
Yes.
I love going to sleep watching documentaries about Titanic.
Stop stealing my bits.
Don't want your bits.
And so, although this was a cheaper option, a horrifying note to make is that from a total of 78 FH227 planes that were made, 23 of them would eventually crash. The case, I mean, that's for the percentage fans out there.
33%.
That is a stat and a half already, Ben.
29 point something
Yeah, about
else.
33, yeah.
Nearly 30%, yeah, nearly.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the particular case we're here to talk about today, it would become the 10th crash of an FH227 since the model was first introduced 6 years earlier in 1966. So yeah, out of 78, 23 of them would crash. That's not a good run rate.
No, not good fly rate either.
No. So despite everything, the reservation was confirmed and the 19 rugby players were notified that since there were 10 additional seats on their flight, they were welcome to bring along friends and family at no extra cost. This is a really sad note to this case. So including coaches and staff of the rugby team, this increased the total number of passengers to 40, along with 5 crew members, which included 2 pilots. The total number on board Flight 571 was 45 people. Tragically, when a last-minute cancellation occurred, word of the flight was spread about the local community, and a 42-year-old lady by the name of Graziella Mariani brought the now spare ticket to ensure that she could be present at her eldest daughter's wedding, which was due to be held over in Chile. Though she was not familiar with any of the passengers, she felt that this was the best option to get her to her daughter on time. The commanding pilot, Colonel Julio César Ferradas, boasted an impressive 5,117 hours of flight experience as an Air Force pilot. He was joined by co-pilot Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Lagurara, who was, in comparison, extremely inexperienced. And on this particular flight, he was due to receive some in-flight training during the journey.
Another element to consider about this particular flight route was that, though it was not particularly common, there had still been numerous concerning incidents that had occurred during previous flights over the Andes mountain range. During the LAN Chile Flight 621 on the 3rd of April 1961, a small plane carrying 24 people, including 8 professional footballers and 2 coaches for CD Green Cross, smashed into the side of a mountain in the Andes after its last radio broadcast hauntingly reported ice quickly developing on its wings and propellers. All 24 people on board the flight were killed, and the crash was in such a remote and unforgiving location that the fuselage from the plane was not found until almost 54 years later, in 2015. 4 years after this, on the 6th of February 1965, LAN Chile Flight 107 crashed into the side of La Corona mountain in the Andes, killing all 88 of its passengers and crew immediately. The Accident Investigation Board later found that the pilot in command was directly responsible for the accident, because he decided to take a route that did not match the approved flight plan of the airline's operations manual. Some have speculated that he did this because of poor weather conditions, though this has been disputed. Finally, in a case surrounded by a slightly more mysterious nature, on the 2nd of August 1947, the British South American Airways Avro-Lacastrian aircraft Stardust mysteriously vanished while flying over the Andes en route from Buenos Aires to Santiago, Chile. For more than half a century, the fate of the plane was unknown, until fragments of it was discovered in a melted glacier in 1998, together with numerous pieces of preserved human remains and clothing, revealing that it had crashed into Mount Tupungato during a severe weather storm. All 11 passengers and crew members were killed in the crash, and bizarrely, the final Morse code message from Stardust to Santiago Airport included the last word Stendec, that is STENDEC, which the airport control tower received 4 minutes before the plane was scheduled to land. This word was repeated twice, and its meaning has never been clearly explained.
So yeah, I mean, from this, basically, we're not saying the Andes mountain range is like the Bermuda Triangle of the skies. It's not a very, very common thing for planes to go missing or crash in this location. But what we're saying is, from what we're able to understand, it takes quite a skilled pilot to go through this particular, or certain parts of this particular range. It wouldn't be an ideal location to sort of do some in-flight training with a very, very new pilot. Although that's not the exact reason why this crash would go on to happen. There have been a history of unfortunate weather-related and aircraft-related accidents on the Andes, and yeah, all of them are quite terrifying. I didn't know another sports team had crashed on the Andes as well. Another football team.
And yeah, this rugby team, they come from quite affluent families, and families pushed them into playing rugby because they thought it was more of a gentlemanly sport and one that showed discipline. Whereas football, they thought you got a lot of egos in football. Is what they said. So it's an interesting one that. I mean, they loved it, and they were really, really, they were champions with the rugby, so they were absolutely excellent at the sport, and they wanted to pursue it for everyone, as you'd imagine. But yeah, it's very sad.
Do you have anything to say, Dan, on them just chartering a plane from the Air Force? Apparently, it was like common.
It did cross my mind. You couldn't do that now, I presume, nowadays.
Yeah, not from. I know you could charter a private one.
Because when they flew to Argentina, they couldn't stay there for 24 hours longer than that, could they? So they had to fly, no matter how shit the weather was, which is an interesting part of it.
Though the incidents are few and far between, flying over the Andes has historically posed some significant challenges for pilots, particularly those with less experience or those in older plane models, making it one of the most hazardous routes in the world. The range itself towers with peaks exceeding 22,000 feet, almost 7,000 metres, demanding aircraft to reach altitudes that older or less powerful planes often struggle to achieve. On top of this, pilots had to contend with rapidly changing weather conditions, including sudden snowstorms, fierce crosswinds, and violent turbulence generated by the mountainous terrain. The Andes are also notorious for the mountain wave effect, where powerful air currents can drag aircraft dangerously up and down in seconds. As well as this, there is extremely thin air at higher altitudes, which can strain engines and cause reduced lift. There is also a complete lack of safe emergency landing zones, with most of the terrain being sheer rock, ice, and narrow valleys. I'm just thinking back to all the times I experienced really bad turbulence in planes. It's never a pleasant experience, even though it is very normal. Before people start shouting at me, it's a scary, scary thing, though.
It is, especially if you're not the most confident of flyers, or you don't go on airplanes that often. Anytime I've experienced really, really bad turbulence has been during nighttime flights, which I don't know if they're more common during daytime or nighttime. I always see them in films during daytime, but they're films. But yeah, this, knowing that you're experiencing turbulence, but you're also in an area where if you do experience problems, there's nowhere safe to land. Everywhere beneath us and around us for miles is extremely sharp, angled, slanted, dangerous to approach, even to try and land. And also you're blinded by the weather conditions and the altitude and the air conditions of the environment. So I can see why I'm already thinking that maybe my comment about the less experienced pilot might be perceived as harsh, and that's not what I was trying to do. But this sounds like it would take a skilled pilot to navigate a clear pathway, especially during those times with that technology. And I know they had certain corridors that they would typically follow to get through the Andes. Pictures of this case at the time and the Andes at the time and even now make it looks so difficult to navigate.
Despite all of this, the players, their coaches, and their many friends and family made their way to Carrasco International Airport. Many of the passengers were aged between 19 and 23 years old, though some friends and family members, including Graziella Mariani, were between a few years to a couple of decades older. Spirits were high, with the players excited for their match against fierce rivals, the Old Boys, though, sadly, this match would never take place. And it is here we move to the timeline of 72 Days of Survival, the tragedy of the Andes.
Thursday, October 12, 1972. Carrasco International Airport, Montevideo. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 took off as normal. On board the plane were 2 pilots, 3 additional crew members, 19 rugby players from the Old Christians Club, as well as coaches and staff members of the team and their friends and family members. As well as this, there was one lady eagerly anticipating her daughter's wedding. There was a total of 45 people on board. The plan was for the plane to head west on a flight path from Montevideo towards Chile, and the first hour of the flight went by without issue. Though it was early springtime in the southern hemisphere, the winter weather had held on in many areas surrounding the Andes mountain range. Winds were fiercer, temperatures were a lot colder, and snowstorms were not uncommon. This reduced the pilots' visibility and caused a great deal of turbulence as they got closer towards the Andes. As a result, the flight was forced to land in the city of Mendoza, Argentina, where the 45 passengers and crew would have to spend the night waiting for conditions to improve. Mendoza, which is located just east of the Andes mountain range, is only 120 miles away, or 194 kilometers, from Santiago, and so it was supposed to be a relatively easy journey to complete once they were able to resume. But the journey required them to travel through the Andes. And yeah, just over this next little bit here, there's going to be a lot of conversions for meters and feet and miles and kilometers.
Sorry, but you said meats.
Meats and feet.
Oh, sorry. Meters and feet. Meters and feet. And yeah, just over this next bit in particular, there's going to be a lot of details in terms of distances and heights, meters and feet, miles and kilometers. So just bear with us for that particular part. They had to divert the flight into Mendoza, Argentina, and they were essentially only allowed to stay in this airport for, was it 24 hours, Tom?
Yeah, it's in Argentina, it's a law that if you're a military plane not from Argentina, you have 24 hours you can stay there. So, yes, and the rugby team, they enjoyed their time there over the night. They had a big old night out and enjoyed it, partied, made the most of the time there, and also were kind of giving the pilots a little bit of jip and come on, we need to get out of here, but the pilots didn't have a choice anyway because of that law. I'm not sure if they kept the law, but if you're a military plane, you could only stay in the airbase for 24 hours.
So they'll now wait overnight and basically waiting for the conditions to ease a little bit, and it seemed as though, certainly the morning after, that the conditions were not going to get any better. So we then moved to Friday, October the 13th, 1972, 2:18 p.m. And this is also day 1 of the 72 days that would follow. On the morning of the flight, the weather conditions over the Andes area had not yet improved, but it was anticipated that the weather would get better by the early afternoon. As soon as, quote, tolerable weather had arrived, the 45 passengers and crew re-entered the aircraft, ready to complete their journey to Santiago. While there was a direct westward path from Mendoza to Santiago, and if you look at it on the map, you're like, yeah, it's just a straight line. It was a lot more complicated than that. The towering mountains of the Andes included Mount Aconcagua, which stands at 6,959 meters or 22,831 feet. And that basically was pretty much at the maximum, quote, service ceiling of which that particular aircraft could get to, which was 8,500 meters or 28,000 feet. With the aircraft fully loaded, this particular direct route would have required careful flying by the pilot in order to steer clear of the mountains. Therefore, it was much more common for the aircrafts, particularly those with turboprops, which is what this plane had, to take the longer 370-mile or 600-kilometer, 90-minute U-shaped route down into Chile. So but essentially what we're saying is they couldn't go straight west, so they had to head a fair amount of miles south to then cross the Andes at an area known as Planchon Pass. And they did this because this was one of the safest and lower altitude areas to cross from Argentina to Chile over the Andes. So they basically had to do a much longer route in order to get there safely. But the weather was still very, very poor.
3:21 p.m, not long after supposedly crossing at Planchon's Pass, co-pilot Lieutenant Colonel Laguirara notified air traffic controllers they expected to be at Curacao a minute later, despite commanding pilot Colonel Furidas having completed this flight route across the Andes 29 times. He was allowing co-pilot Laguirara to control the plane whilst he trained him. The pair quickly noticed that, as they entered the Andes, a large volume of clouds and snow seemed to obscure the visibility of the vast mountain range that was supposed to be far below them. When there is such a large amount of cloud cover, pilots must operate under IMCs, or Instrument Meteorological Conditions. This means that they rely mainly on flight instruments instead of their visual perception. Essentially, they are dependent on the altitude they believe they are at compared to the altitude of the surrounding mountains, but only if they are truly in the location that they believe they are. The pilots were flying at an altitude of 5,500 metres, which is approximately 18,000 feet, under IMCs, navigating through what they thought was the Planchon Pass. However, they could not visually confirm the location based on the terrain below. Some reports suggest that the co-pilot, Laguirara, miscalculated his position using dead reckoning, but he was actually depending on radio navigation. For reasons that are not completely clear, he failed to notice the aircraft's navigation radio, which was showing the bearing and distance to the Curacao radio beacon, located 37 to 43 miles, that's about 60 to 69 kilometres, due west of the Planchon Pass. Some have speculated that he did not take into account a headwind and therefore miscalculated his ground speed. The flight duration from Planchon Pass to Curacao is usually 11 minutes. However, just 3 minutes later, the co-pilot informed Santiago that they were flying over Curacao and turning north. He asked air traffic control for permission to start to descend. The controller allowed the aircraft to descend down to 3,500 metres, which is about 11,500 foot, not realising due to poor radar coverage that the plane was actually still directly above the Andes. The commanding pilot Furidas also did not notice this navigation mistake. Something had gone terribly wrong.
So basically, they are flying above a heavily clouded mountain range. They can't see what's directly below them, directly in front of them, to the right, to the left. There's also loads of snow everywhere. They're going off of this IMC using the technology of the time to navigate where they believe to be. As we mentioned when Dan was talking about all the difficulties of flying in this area, there are a lot of headwinds, there are lots of unpredictable mountain wave effects, which can move the plane suddenly and obviously move them out of the orientation that they think they're in. So they've called to say, can we now start to descend, thinking they're in a completely safe area to do so. They're essentially now descending rapidly into a very sharp, very staggered mountain range, which is, terrifying.
The aircraft immediately faced intense turbulence during its descent, and its ground collision alarm started to sound, which terrified the passengers on board. Quickly, during short moments where the cloud briefly cleared, the pilot started to notice mountain ranges all around them, with one huge one directly in front of them. Other passengers also started to observe mountains and cliff edges surrounding their plane outside the window. Nando Parado, one of the survivors, remembered that the plane quickly dropped several hundred feet out of the clouds. He began to climb. He pulled the nose up until the plane was nearly completely vertical, and it began to stall and shake. There were lots of loud alarms. That was probably the moment when the pilot saw the black ridge rising dead ahead.
There have been many films and documentaries made about this case. There have been numerous animations made of the crash sequence. There's a YouTube channel that basically recreates famous air traffic disasters, and it's he actually maps out the entire flight as well as the later hike that we're going to talk about, the crash disaster scene. So we'll pop all these links in our Facebook group. But imagine that, Dan, you're in an, because have you been in a plane that's flown through clouds before? Because even then you can get a little bit of turbulence.
Flown through clouds, boy,
But humble brag. But in those moments when you're coming back home, for example, usually you go through the clouds and then there you go, England. Mm-hmm. The grimness of being back in England it hits you and you're back from your holiday. But going through those clouds to then suddenly being able to see everything beneath you, imagine that, but mountain ranges.
And seeing like the detail of the mountain range and seeing it so close in front of you. And probably the instant thought is, how do you get out of this? You can't. And I don't know what it is. Like, I bloody love planes. I love everything about them. I love how they look, how they sound, and how they perform. But there is something terrifying about being on a plane quite often. I mean, it's obviously an irrational fear for a lot of people because planes are one of the safest modes of transport out there. And I ride a motorbike, but it's a terrifying thought being stuck in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely terrifying.
3:34 p.m. The pilots tried everything they could and used full power to try and ascend and clear the 4,200 metres or 13,800 foot high southern ridge of the glacier's top. The co-pilot managed to lift the aircraft over part of the ridge, but the lower part of the tail cone is believed to have grazed the ridge at its peak. The next impact broke the right wing. Large smashes were heard within the plane, whilst passengers began to scream out and pray for their lives. Some evidence suggests that the initial strike of the glacier top threw the plane back with such force that it could have caused the tail cone to fully detach. When the tail cone was ripped off, it took the back part of the aircraft with it, including 2 rows of seats, the galley, baggage hold, vertical stabiliser and horizontal stabiliser, also leaving a large hole in the rear, which people were soon either forcibly thrown out of or had already been detached from in the impact. 3 passengers, the navigator and a flight attendant were lost along with the tail section on a separate part of the mountain range. Witnesses and evidence from the future crash site suggested that the plane hit the mountain at least 2 or potentially even 3 separate times.
So yeah, we'll pop some animations and recreations in film of this very famous crash scene. It basically looks, from the pilot's perspective, it looks as though, we've cleared it, but then the back end of the plane has clipped the top of the mountain ridge and then thrown it violently into another immovable path, which has caused serious damage to the plane and those within it.
The plane's speed and its working engine pushed it up and forward until a rock formation at 4,400 metres, 14,400 feet, completely ripped off the left wing. A propeller then cut through part of the body of the plane. 2 more passengers were ejected from the large opening at the exposed tail end. The remaining body of the plane fell onto the snow and slid 725 metres, 2,379 feet, down the steep glacier slope at approximately 220 miles per hour. Or 350 kilometres an hour, before it then crashed into a snowbank and stopped abruptly. The seats detached from the floor and slammed into the front wall of the plane like a set of dominoes. The crash almost completely crushed the cockpit, trapping both pilots against the instrument panel, instantly killing 39-year-old commanding pilot Ferradas. Upon examination of the cockpit post-crash, it was confirmed that Ferradas had lost his life on the spot, while his co-pilot, Dante Lagarara, sustained serious life-threatening injuries.
Yeah, so we have a Google Street View of the crash scene and where the remnants of the plane eventually came to a stop at. And I know we talked about there's never anywhere safe to land, and it wouldn't have been if the plane hadn't broken up the way it did. There is a slight, very, very slight, in the context of this case, there is a slight bit of fortune that those that were protected within the remnants of the plane were able to slide down this glacier to a point of safety somewhat, although it injured almost all of them, this sudden stop, smashing into a almost abrupt stop at 220 miles an hour. It's going to cause some serious damage. Yeah. Not only the survival story as to why it's called a miracle on the Andes, it's a miracle that they were able to survive this part, and it still only gets so much worse from here onwards.
The aircraft's fuselage eventually settled in the cirque of the glacier, which was later named Glacier de las Lágrimas, also known as the Glacier of Tears. At an altitude of 3,675 metres, which is approximately 12,057 foot, in the Mendoza province, Argentina, it was located not far from the Tinguiririca volcano, positioned in the isolated mountainous border between Chile and Argentina. Tragically, the plane ended up 50 miles, which is about 80 kilometres east of its intended path. Those who were somehow able to survive the crash were now deep within the world's largest and one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges. Survivors reported smelling burning jet fuel all around them, witnessing people with horrendous injuries, including multiple broken bones, gaping wounds, and one individual whose brain seemed to have been exposed and was literally splitting out of its head. Many people were completely unconscious, others were fighting for their lives. The commanding pilot, the team's doctor, and 3 other people had died instantly or within a few hours of the crash, while 7 others were lost and presumed to be dead, from the tail section and exposed rear of the plane. Included in the dead was the wife of the team's doctor, as well as the mother of one of the players, Nando Parado, who had sustained a skull fracture and was presumed to be dead by the other survivors, and whose 20-year-old sister, Susanna, was also seriously injured in the crash. Many others were left with life-changing injuries. Quickly, those who were able to, particularly medical students Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zabino, tended to the injured and adjusted to their new surroundings. Makeshift splints and slings were created for those with broken bones, while many attempted to stem the bleeding of those seriously injured with pieces of clothing taken from luggage. A man by the name of Enrique Platero had a piece of metal lodged in his abdomen, which, when taken out, also pulled out a few inches of his intestine with it. Despite this, he quickly started assisting others in aiding the injured. A total of 33 people had survived the crash to varying degrees. Many of them had sustained critical or fatal injuries, with 5 deceased and 7 missing from the scene. Many of the survivors had broken arms or legs, with multiple people sustaining compound fractures. None of the individuals who sustained compound fractures would survive. One individual, Arturo Noguera, had sustained multiple breaks in both his legs, and as we mentioned, commanding pilot Ferradas had died immediately when the nose gear pushed the instrument panel into his chest, causing his head to be forced out of the windshield, whilst co-pilot Lieutenant Laguara had suffered severe injuries and was trapped in the now wrecked cockpit. He requested a passenger to retrieve his gun and to shoot him, but the passengers declined to do so. He would pass away within the next 24 hours. As hours that must have felt like minutes started to pass, survivors started to note how incredibly cold the surroundings were. Any fires that somehow managed to build were quickly blown out by the elements, and they had very few materials to make additional fires with. Survivors would later state their efforts were futile. Even if a fire burned for just a few minutes, it would make the cold feel so much worse after a brief bit of warmth. It was agreed that the survivors would use what was left of the body of the plane to create a shelter. Once they had removed the deceased, they boarded up the torn rear of the plane with luggage, as some tried, impossibly, to sleep through the pain of their injuries without the appropriate pain medication. Yeah, that's truly... I'm sure everyone has been cold to the point of like, you just want to be inside and you're like, it's painful, your hands are that cold. You're just thinking that it's just not even the tiniest bit as cold as these people will be feeling, and then you're putting that with extreme trauma to their bodies, trauma to their minds as well, in terms of obviously what's just happened, seeing all these dead bodies around you, friends and family dying in front of you. And yeah, it's having the strength to even dig through and try to help other people when you broken arms, broken legs. Yeah, you can't, it's very hard to fathom that scene that's just played out.
Yeah, this is the first part for me where it's not just the situation. I mean, they've miraculously survived a plane crash, but from here, everything now goes against them in their bid to survive. If they light a fire, a few minutes at most, they're going to have a warm fire surrounding them. It's going to quickly get blown out. And like Tom said, if you've been cold before, if you've been really, really cold, you can only stand it for a few moments. This was their reality, the ones that survived for the next more than 2 months. Constant. And at night, so much worse at night as well.
In the hour that followed the crash, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service were alerted that the flight was missing. 4 planes started searching for the aircraft based on its last known location in the Curacao corridor. News about the missing flight reached Uruguayan media at around 6 p.m. that evening, with loved ones watching on in horror. When Air Search and Rescue officials were unable to locate the crash site, they reviewed recordings of the radio communications and determined that the aircraft likely crashed in one of the most remote and hard-to-reach areas of the Andes. They requested additional help from the Andes Rescue Group of Chile. Unknown to both the passengers and the search teams, the flight had already crashed in Argentina long before entering Chile. To add to their dire circumstances, the 33 survivors only had the following rations in their proximity: 8 chocolate bars, 3 small jars of jam, a small tin of mussels, a tin of almonds, a few dates, some candy, dried plums, and several bottles of wine. Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zabino, 2 men who had saved many lives in the initial recovery process, knew they would likely wake up the following morning to additional deaths. Yeah, and I think with the wine as well, I think they got through like 5 or 7 bottles in the first night, which, it's with all that energy exerted and digging people out and moving things around, lugging luggage in extreme conditions, you don't blame them, and as well, alcohol as well to aid with the pain. But yeah, that is... Yeah.
So we then move to October 14th, 1972, day 2. Tragically, as the sun started to peek over the glacier that the group now found themselves stuck in, 43-year-old Graziella Mariani, the lady who had brought a spare ticket in hopes of attending her daughter's wedding, was in the process of passing away. After the crash, she found herself trapped in the debris of seats that had collided with the luggage area. Both of her legs were broken in multiple places and had actually become lodged in twisted seats. Although the survivors had tried desperately to help and free her, their attempts were sadly in vain. Graziella had bravely suffered through a night filled with heartbreaking screams, with her cries and energy slowly diminishing over time. She ultimately lost her battle not long before noon. As well as this, as we mentioned, co-pilot Lieutenant Laguara, who is blamed by some communities, or by many in fact, for this tragic series of events, also passed away later that day, together with 2 students and 21-year-old rugby player Francisco Abal. Francisco had actually switched from a window seat to an aisle seat with Nando Parrado, and this decision would ultimately end his life but save the life of Nando. Following the crash, Francisco sustained many severe injuries, particularly to his legs, but he was able to speak despite his condition. Later that night, as he was laid next to the filled hole of the fuselage, in a faint voice he called out for help that was unfortunately unavailable to him, and he was trying his best to vocalize this as loud as he could, but he was only able to whisper that he was freezing to death. The next morning, other survivors discovered that he had succumbed to his injuries and the harsh elements. Of the 45 passengers and crew, 10 were now deceased, 7 were still missing, and only 28 were still alive. Later that day, 11 planes from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay searched all over the Andes for the missing flight. The search area included the actual crash site, and some aircraft even flew over the crash location multiple times. Survivors immediately felt as though they were going to be rescued, as they could clearly see the planes in the sky. However, the same could not be said about the circling plane's view of the ground. There were still adverse weather conditions in the area, and the white top of the plane became a needle in a haystack amongst the snow-covered mountains. The survivors attempted to use lipstick found in their luggage to write a large SOS message on the roof of the fuselage, but they lacked enough lipstick to create large enough letters to be visible from the air by rescuers. They also arranged luggage to form a cross in the snow, but it was also not enough to catch the rescuers' attention. They also carved a large SOS message into the snow as well, but once again this was not seen. The survivors noticed aircraft flying over the crash site 3 times, but the rescuers could not see the white fuselage against the snow, nor could they see any of the survivors frantically waving for their help. Their hearts sank collectively as the plane slowly left the general area without any signs of returning. Which, for them thinking that, okay, it's been an absolutely terrifying ordeal already, we've lost loved ones, a lot of people are still really badly hurt, but on the second day to start seeing planes circling the area, you're starting to think, okay, rescue is coming. But then the planes stop and they do not return for many, many days. And how bleak to know that they've kind of given up on the situation. The 28 remaining survivors started to clear out the broken seats and other debris to create a makeshift shelter measuring a total of 2.5 by 3 meters or 8 by 10 feet. They then blocked the back of the fuselage with a combination of luggage, seats, and snow. A man by the name of Adolfo Fito Strauch created a solar-powered water collector using the metal sheet that he had found underneath the seats. The metal would heat up and melt the snow into water, from which he would collect in bottles below. This, which I didn't even comprehend this, but to avoid snow blindness with the sun reflecting off the snow into their eyes, he also made each of the survivors sunglasses by cutting the green plastic sun visors from the cockpit and attaching them to pieces of brass straps with electrical wire. The survivors would have to urinate into cut open rugby balls within the fuselage, as if they went to the toilet outside, the external temperatures would cause their urine to freeze. They fashioned woolen seat covers into coats in order to stay warm, and they made seat cushions into snowshoes. Marcelo Perez, who was the rugby team captain, stepped up to lead this new team of survivors. Though reports vary massively, it is stated that in the year of 1972, overnight temperatures in the general area of the crash site could reach as low as minus 30 degrees Celsius on the mountain. None of them had appropriate clothing, gloves, or footwear for the climate. As we mentioned, they could not light any long-standing fires for more than a few moments, and they would have to constantly huddle to remain warm. And I imagine in trying to huddle to remain warm, many of them had serious injuries, broken bones. All of the survivors had spent their whole lives in a much warmer climate over by the ocean in Uruguay, and some had never even witnessed snow before the accident. None possessed any wilderness training or experience in surviving in high altitudes.
The layers of trauma just goes on and on and on in this one, doesn't it? It's an endless battle against all odds.
And it's, as I said at the start, it's just when you think it couldn't get any worse or any more against them, there are still 2 or 3 more things that are insane to add to the dynamic of this case. And they still, 16 of them still survived.
October 21st, 1972, day 9. After searching for more than 142 hours, the search and rescue team determined that the likelihood of anyone surviving the crash was 0, and subsequently ended their search. They claimed in a broadcast that they intended to restart the search to retrieve the victim's body in December once the snow had melted. And for any confusion, because I certainly was confused at this point, obviously the other side of the equator is south of the equator, so around that time it's warmer. It's summertime, would you say, Ben?
Yeah. I mean, this is for them October, early spring. So yeah, December, summertime would make sense. And that's it. They've written this case off now to say, we'll go and retrieve the bodies, but we're not going to do any additional rescue attempts. We've scoured the whole area and we can't see anything. And at this point, there's 27, nearly 30 people still alive. And this is day 9 of what would become 72 days. So sad.
Immediately after coming out of his 3-day coma, Nando Parado took up the position of caregiver to his younger sister, Susana, not long after learning that his mother, Eugenia, had sadly passed away in the crash. Susana suffered severe injuries in the plane crash. Her face was marked with wounds and bruises, and her feet were darkened by the cold. Although she was mostly conscious, she was confused about her surroundings and kept calling for her mother. Nando dedicated himself to looking after her until the end. He attempted to warm her frozen feet by rubbing them, but it didn't help. He patiently offered her drinks and small bits of chocolate, but she ultimately declined both. Tragically, she passed away later that night.
Yeah, so sad. So Nando, who a lot of people had believed was dead for the first few days, was in a coma for the brain injury that he'd suffered. He's then up and about, and he's been informed his mum's passed away, his sister's critically unwell, and she's then passed away, moments after he's come back to full consciousness. It's so sad. And without him, this case doesn't happen. I mean, there are loads of heroes from this group, all of them were, but without him, Gustavo and Roberto, this case could have ended in a much different way.
2 days after this, the team found a small transistor radio wedged between some debris and were able to improvise a working antenna from wiring within the plane. During their 11th day on the mountain, they were finally able to obtain a working radio feed, where they collectively made the horrifying discovery that the search for them had been called off. The survivors recalled this devastating realisation.
The others who had clustered around Roy upon hearing the news began to sob and pray, all except Nando, who looked calmly up at the mountains which rose to the west. Gustavo came out of the aircraft and, seeing their faces, knew what they had heard. Gustavo looked at the mournful faces looking at him. "Hey boys," he shouted. "There's some good news we just heard on the radio. They've called off the search." Inside the crowded aircraft there was silence. As the hopelessness of their predicament enveloped them, they wept. "Why the hell is that good news?" Paez shouted angrily at Gustavo. "Because it means that we're going to get out of here on our own." The courage of this one man prevented a flood of total despair from overcoming the group. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? You can understand why they'd be like, what's he saying? But it's put it into their hands. They're going to have to act. They can't just sit there waiting. It's on them now to act. Which I guess is, the fact that he's managed to turn that into some comfort and some energy is within itself just shows his character.
Yeah, we'll put it up throughout this episode, the street view that you can get a 360 panoramic view of the crash site. There's less snow on there when this image was captured, but all you can see as far as the eye will go and all the way to the horizon is mountains. And it looks just like a labyrinth of cliff edges and mountain peaks, and there's just, I don't know where you'd even start to think this is going to be my route out, that's going to be my route out. It is terrifying to look at what these poor people would have been faced with. For Gustavo, bringing in a bit of lightness at their darkest hour, I think, yeah, I couldn't imagine being in their perspective.
October 24th, 1972, which is day 12, many of the survivors began to suggest different ideas about how they may escape the glacier that they found themselves on in a bid to try and find rescue of their own. Some suggested climbing to the nearest mountain peaks, others suggested hiking in different directions. Many were too weak to move on and too scared for others to risk further injury in leaving the group. They became dependent on one another during their turmoil. Even with the improvised snowshoes, it was almost impossible for those that were fit and healthy to travel very far. The terrain was incredibly difficult to navigate. Hidden crevices were buried beneath the snow, and it was very easy, especially considering how little they had eaten in 2 weeks, for the men to become incredibly weak and exhausted quickly. As well as this, breathing at such a high altitude was also more difficult for them. Whilst trying to head up to the most local mountain peaks, 5 of the missing 7 people were found deceased. This brought the total number of deceased to 16, with 2 still missing and 27 survivors. Those that were able to make it into various peaks were left with the heartbreaking task of informing their fellow survivors that all they could see for miles to the horizon was additional mountain ranges. Yeah, you mean you climbing up there with just the hope. And obviously you know how much energy it takes to do any of that, let alone once you're injured and not dressed properly. Also with, no knowledge on the safety measures and what's the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do in that situation as well. And the thing about the high altitude as well is it actually makes you thirstier, which, because you're breathing so quickly because you need more breath, then you're drying your mouth out quicker, therefore you need more liquids. It's literally it's a situation where, lack of sustenance is, it's highlighted even more so here, like, extreme colds and extreme heats. It's just, everything is stacked against them, and you manage to muster that strength to kind of push on, and then you're just greeted by mountains upon mountains as far as the eye can see. Within those exploratory treks, one group nearly froze to death when they were able to recover multiple luggage bags that included a box of chocolates, 3 meat patties, a bottle of rum, Coca-Cola bottles, cigarettes, extra clothes, comic books, some medicine, and most importantly, the aircraft's batteries. I mean, that's a good haul, isn't it?
That's a very good haul.
They chose to find shelter for the night in the tail section, lit a fire to keep warm, and spent the night reading comic books. Most of the search groups headed to the west due to what they claimed they overheard the pilot's discussion location-wise prior to the crash. However, if they headed just 13 miles east, they would have found Hotel Termas El Sostenido, an abandoned hot springs resort.
Which in this, I mean, it's an abandoned hotel, but for shelter, it looks like a very forgiving place in the context of this case when you see pictures of this hotel that was just a few miles away, but they would have had no way of seeing it from the mountains that were blocking their view. And obviously they all thought they were in a certain location, which meant the quickest way off the Andes would have been to head west, when in fact, if they headed east, though the trek would have been much more dangerous, it would have got them to Chile.
Yeah, I believe the hotel also had lots of canned food and supplies there as well, just to kind of rub it in a bit more. It wasn't in use at the time, but it still had some things that would make, shelter in itself would make their lives a lot easier. But yeah, that's just, you can imagine when they found that out, that would be,
Natural hot springs as well. October 29th, 1972, and we move now to day 17. As if their situation was not already bleak enough, shortly before midnight, whilst many of the survivors were either sleeping or clinging on to what remained of their lives, the silence was broken by the sound of a roaring. An avalanche swept down the mountaintop, completely covering the fuselage and filling it with ice and snow in the process. 8 people were smothered to death by the falling snow, including the rugby team's captain. The avalanche completely covered the fuselage, filling it to within just 1 meter from the ceiling. The remaining survivors were now trapped inside, and they quickly understood that they would soon run out of air if they didn't act. Nando Parado grabbed a metal pole from the luggage racks and used it to open one of the cockpit windscreens in order to create a hole in the snow for fresh air. Almost 30 hours later, on the morning of October 31st, the group managed to somehow dig out an exit tunnel with great difficulty from the cockpit all the way to the surface. And just like everything seems to be as a theme in this case, once they find a glimmer of hope, they've got their way to the surface only to encounter yet another blizzard that forced them to crawl back into the buried fuselage. And again, they're being forced to crawl back into a snow-filled remnants of a plane that also has 8 of their friends deceased within that piece of fuselage. Despite the other severe challenges that the group faced on the mountain, survivor Jose Luis Insarte described the night of the avalanche, as well as the impact that it had on the group, as the worst part of the entire 72-day ordeal. The remaining survivors were buried in the fuselage alongside many of their deceased friends and family members. November 3rd, 1972, day 22. With the blizzard raging on for an additional 3 days, we arrive at the most divisive and controversial element of this week's case. Having been trapped inside the fuselage with their recently deceased friends and family members, the conversation surrounding cannibalism eventually arose. And this is what I mentioned at the start of the episode, the new word I've learned, the new lurd I've learned. So basically the word I learned, I mean, there's 2 words. There's anthropophagy and then there's also autophagy. And it's the argument that cannibalism, the using the word cannibalism in the context of this case is wrong to do because it wasn't outright an act of cannibalism. These individuals were aware of what they were doing to survive, whereas typical acts of cannibalism can imply the thrill or the feelings gained when committing those acts. So the Jeffrey Dahmer and other cases we've covered where things like that have been suggested. Yeah, people say that cannibalism is the wrong word to use in this particular case, but either way, the group are now concealed within this buried piece of fuselage. They're starving to death slowly, and they're now suggesting the potential of consuming their dead friends and family members that are trapped in there with him, which is just, unless you've ever been in their situation, I don't feel like you have a right to judge them.
Yeah, from doing the research of this, I've heard that they were basically saying, if I go, please eat my body, basically. They were saying to each other, if I was to pass on next, please don't think about it twice, eat me, because for you guys to survive. And then it went around to the conversation of saying about, well, that's what all of us have said this. So, it's right. The people that have passed before us would have probably had the same opinions as us. So, they looked at it that kind of way. And also, it's right to say that these people were Catholic, and the thought of, the body of Christ and the blood of Christ and taking that in communion and whatnot, that also came into the thinking as well and the discussion of that. And this, they've been given a chance here to carry on for longer. So why wouldn't they do that? It wasn't an easy decision to be made, of course, but they felt that, with their opinions around that situation, it'd be right for them to do it rather than just let the bodies go to waste and then waste along with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was, just to point out, there was absolutely no vegetation in the surrounding areas, no animals. Yes, they had an endless amount of water that they could produce by melting the snow, but there was absolutely nothing else left at this point. So after days, and I mean, they've been concealed in this piece of fuselage with their dead friends and family for almost 4 days now. After days of agonizing over the moral dilemma that they now faced, some survivors decided that they would have to eat the remains of the dead in order to stay alive. They had all been living off of a ration of 1 chocolate-covered peanut per person per 3 days. As I mentioned, there were no plants or animals, and when the food was completely gone, they attempted to consume the cotton filling from the seats and the leather from their belts and shoes, which made them ill. Realizing that rescue attempts had ended and knowing that they would likely now starve to death on the mountain, the survivors allowed one another to use their bodies for sustenance if they perished. They discussed at length their opinions and spiritual stance on the situation, stating that, as Tom said, they felt that if the roles were reversed, they would hope to have been consumed by survivors in order to keep them alive for slightly longer. So instead of eating family members or friends, they started with the remains of the pilot and the co-pilot, who they did not know personally. Nando Parado, whose sister and mother had died in the crash, was viciously protective of their bodies and refused to let them be eaten. Although there was one survivor who was initially very reluctant to partake in this situation, survivors who had made the agonizing decision to eat the remains of the deceased stated that they would only consume the muscle, fat, and skin. However, later reports would suggest that they would also go on to consume the internal organs of the dead. Nando Parado would later recall, "It was soft and greasy, streaked with blood and bits of wet cartilage. I gagged hard when I placed it in my mouth." Roberto Canessa used a piece of shattered windshield glass to cut the meat. He decided to lead by example, swallowing the first small piece of human flesh, which was apparently about the size of a matchstick. Over the next few days, several others did the same thing, but a few continued to refuse to eat it.
Yeah, Ben, just to go back to your new word that you've learned, it is correct, anthropophagy. It's actually a word for, it's a neutral scientific word that removes the negative connotations associated with cannibalism. So it kind of removes the necessity or the ritual aspect of cannibalism. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about the criticism that this group faced, but I think no one has a right to criticize or condemn them unless they've been in that situation. That's kind of my stance on it. But Roberto on this series of events would state the following.
Our common goal was to survive, but what we lacked was food. We had long since run out of the meagre pickings we found on the plain, and there was no vegetation or animal life to be found. After just a few days, we had the sensation that our own bodies were consuming themselves just to remain alive. Before long, we would become too weak to recover from starvation. We knew the answer, but the answer was just too terrifying to contemplate. The bodies of our friends and teammates preserved outside in the snow and ice contained the vital, life-preserving proteins that would keep us alive. But could we do it? For a long time we agonised. I went out in the snow and prayed to God for guidance. Without his consent, I felt I would be violating the memory of my friends, that I would be stealing their souls. We wondered whether we were going mad to even contemplate such a deed. Had we turned into brute savages? Or was this the only alternative for us to survive? Truly, we were pushing the limits of our fear.
So over the next month, this is how the group would survive. Sadly, 3 more survivors would pass away from a combination of starvation and the elements. The remaining group tried to build a radio that would be able to send a signal or a broadcast to those that had long given up searching for them, but it would prove ineffective. The last survivors now understood that their only escape was to scale the mountains on the western edge of the glacier's cirque, which surrounded them. However, this climb was unfeasible unless they figured out how they could endure the freezing temperatures that they would encounter at high altitudes during the night. And again, they have no climbing equipment, no warm clothing, no protective gear, nothing like that. And these glaciers surrounding them are massive. The group then created a sleeping bag using insulation from the back of the fuselage, electrical wire, and the waterproof material that covered the plane's air conditioning unit.
December 12th, 1972, day 61. Though 2 of the 3 men were reluctant, Antonio Vizintin, Roberto Canessa, and Nando Parado embarked on what would become one of the most unbelievable survival stories in history. They lacked rock climbing equipment, a map of the area, a compass, and any climbing experience. The 3 of them ascended a glacier that stood 3,664 metres high, pausing briefly on rocky ledges to rest in their makeshift sleeping bag. They shared the improvised sleeping bag that kept them warm through the nights. Nando led the way, with the other 2 frequently asking him to slow down. Roberto Canessa described it as the worst night of his life. The ascent was slow and difficult. The survivors at the base camp observed their climb for 3 long days. As they reached one of the tallest ridges, they were met by a 360-degree view of mountain ranges surrounding them. Nando said the following to Roberto. "Roberto, can you imagine how beautiful this would be if we were not walking dead?" The trio now understood that their mission to find help would take much longer than expected. So they agreed that Antonio Vizintin should head back to base camp so the other two could have enough supplies to finish their trip. Vizintin's journey back was all downhill, and he used an airplane seat as a makeshift sled to reach base camp in under an hour. The pair then shared the following harrowing exchange with one another. Roberto, we're dead. Nando, we may be walking to our deaths, but I would rather walk to meet my death than wait for it to come to me. Roberto, you and I are friends, Nando. We have been through so much. Now let's go die together.
Yeah, this scene, the climbing scene here in the original movie Alive, and then the more recent ones of Society of the Snow. Any slight movement on this cliff edge, very, very high up, and they are going to fall to their deaths very quickly. And it's taken them 3 days to get this high, to then be met with a scene of just mountains as far as they could see. And they realize now that their actual hike is going to take them days, maybe even weeks longer than what they anticipated.
And it also alerted to them when they looked down at the plane that you couldn't see it. So it's like, if we can't see it from here, then how a plane's going to see it? Which, again, would be truly soul-destroying. Again, like, rather than giving up, it's, well, let's carry on. I know they're saying die together, but yeah, they were very level-headed with their thinking. I think was one of the things with this case. They were, as before, they're able to make things out of, utilize the things that are there on the plane and from the wreckage and make items, make snow boots, figure out a way of melting the snow in an effective manner for water. And even with this idea of they had the hikers, people that are going to go out there, they would give the rations to them more so they'd be stronger for the hike.
Yeah.
You'd think being in that situation, you wouldn't be thinking straight as such, but they still were able to form very kind of logical thinking and practical thinking, which that surprises me just as much as anything.
Well, for such young people as well. They were majority aged 19 to 22, 23. Unfortunately, a lot of the slightly older people had passed away. So they'd never been in a situation, anything like that. They weren't from a climate like that either. They were from, southern Uruguay, down by the coast, lovely weather. And it's, yeah, just miraculous. Such is the name. Oh, sorry.
What do you say?
Just such is the name, miracle and miraculous. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, to cut that bit up once. December 14th, 1972, day 63. The body of Carlos Valeta was discovered by the three men hiking for rescue. It was found that Carlos had been ejected from the back of the fuselage during the initial crash. Carlos had somehow survived the drop, but he subsequently and unintentionally fell into deep snow and suffocated to death while trying to navigate down the snowy glacier to his fellow survivors. December 20th, 1972, day 69. After hiking in unimaginable conditions on the brink of their deaths for an astonishing 10 days, covering a total of between 33 to 38 miles, which is around 53 to 61 kilometers, as well as climbing numerous glaciers and cliff edges at more than 5,000 combined meters, Nando and Roberto finally reached Chile. They arrived at the narrow valley that Nando had observed from the mountain's peak. Here, they discovered a small stream that was actually the origin of the Rio San Jose. They kept descending alongside the river until they reached the end of the snow line. Slowly, they began to notice increasing signs of human presence. Initially, an abandoned soup can, and eventually a few cows. Despite the elation of the situation, both men were slowly dying. Roberto said to Nando, "I'm tired. I don't know why, I'm so tired." To which Nando replied, "You're not tired, we're dying." Roberto was beyond exhaustion and could no longer continue walking, so they decided to rest for the night while collecting wood for a fire. Nando noticed three men on horseback on the opposite side of the river. Nando shouted to them, but the sound of the rushing water made it hard to hear. One of the men on the other side spotted Nando and Roberto and yelled back, "Tomorrow." The following morning, the man came back, wrote a note, attached it with a pencil to a stone, and tossed the stone over to Nando. Nando wrote back the following.
I come from an airplane that crashed in the mountains. I'm Uruguayan. We've been walking for 10 days. I have a wounded friend up there. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We need to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how to. We don't have any food. We are very weak. When are you going to come get us? Please, we can't even walk. Where are we?
Yeah, I think Nando as well was nervous about throwing the rock back, how weak he was by this point, but luckily he was able to make it. The man, who was a Chilean arriero, essentially someone who transports goods on horseback, responded by throwing a loaf of bread across the river to the men. He then rode for 10 hours straight in order to get additional help for the men, asking other strangers that he encountered to head back to the two men. 72 days after the plane vanished in the Andes, two emaciated figures had stumbled out of the mountains, their faces burned by the sun, their bodies worn to the bone. Behind them lay a story so unthinkable, so extraordinary, that rescuers could scarcely believe it. They had survived what no one else could. The crash of Flight 571, the freezing nights, avalanches, starvation, and the unthinkable choices that kept them alive. Though the journey of the miracle of the Andes was now at an end, it would still take many years for the wounds to truly heal.
Yeah, massive shout out to that man. 10 hours he rode straight to get help. His name was Sergio Catalan, and there's a photo of him with Roberto and Nando. Quite a famous photo. Amazing. If you get the wrong person on the other side of the river that's not willing to go out of their way like that to help, then you've done all of that.
Yeah.
For nothing.
Definitely.
Shout out Sergio. Both men were later rushed to nearby police and medical facilities where they informed rescue workers of the other 14 survivors still up on the mountain. Multiple helicopters then headed to the location that the pair described, where they ultimately were able to rescue the remaining 14 survivors. And yeah, they rescued 2 separate groups over 2 separate days, but kept rescue workers with them with supplies and warmth and food. All 16 men were transported to nearby hospitals in Santiago for assessment and received treatment for altitude sickness, dehydration, frostbite, fractures, scurvy, and malnutrition. Roberto and Nando had lost nearly half their body weight since the crash, with Roberto weighing a staggering 44 kilograms, or 97 pounds. Typically, the search and rescue teams would have also retrieved the remains of the deceased for a proper burial. However, since the recovery would have needed to take place on Argentinian soil, the Chilean rescuers opted to leave the bodies behind until the Argentine authorities determined the next steps. The Chilean military documented the bodies with photographs and mapped the crash site before heading back to Chile. The authorities in Argentina, meanwhile, and the families of the victims chose to inter the victims' remains at the crash site in a shared grave. 13 bodies were intact, whilst another 15 were just skeletal remains. All 16 survivors, but particularly 19-year-old Roberto and 22-year-old Nando, had made one of the greatest physical achievements in the history of mankind in not only surviving, but their hike out of the area they were trapped in. Considering their circumstances and the fact that everything around them seemed to be trying to kill them, it was truly remarkable. It's hard to contemplate the feeling of despair that they must have felt when they realized they were in the middle of the Andes and that nobody was coming for them, and that there was no realistic way to even hike out of the area. It has been suggested that what helped the men in particular was the fact that they were all relatively young athletes, full of life and approaching the situation with optimism. People have said that this was a massive factor in them not ever giving up. And I think I mentioned earlier in the episode, there's a YouTube channel called Dude Tours, and he recreates infamous air disasters and vehicle disasters. And in this particular episode he does on YouTube, there's one on this case, and he recreates not only the flight origin pathway into the crash scene, but also via flight simulator follows Nando's and Roberto's hike and climb. And it's,
wow,
I don't know how they did it. We'll pop some footage in the episode for you, but it doesn't look real. It doesn't look possible. It looks literally impossible for them to have done it in there, even if they were fit and healthy with the gear, to have done it when they were.
But it's also the constant cold. That's the thing, isn't it? That's what, like you said at the beginning of the episode, Ben, it's like, even when it's slightly cold here, it's difficult to think and do things, and it's uncomfortable. But to be, minus almost 30 degrees centigrade at that point is consistently just so impressive.
they kept them going as well. There was a lot of like humor between them, even in the morbid situation. Like they were, when they knew that people were coming, to save them, they were joking when they were waiting for the rescue to come, that they'll pose and just be like, "You all right?" When they come and they'll welcome them, they'll act as if like nothing had happened, kind of thing. And they're joking throughout and having a laugh with each other still, which I think keeping morale up in that situation was integral, but would be very hard to do. Yeah, but it seemed to be the perfect blend of people to survive the absolute nightmare blend of situation.
Yeah, when there's some interviews with survivors, well, there's loads of interviews with survivors, but there's also interviews with the survivors' family members who literally described it as their sons coming back from the dead. They'd already had, funerals, already thought that they'd lost their loved ones to then be met by this and these stories. And then obviously we're going to talk about the other stories that would come out of how they survived. Unbelievable. I remember when the Alive movie came out, I was very young, maybe too young to watch it at the time, but I remember my dad making sure I watched the film, not telling me about anything that was going to happen, but that this was a real story. And then there was the crash, the survival, then the acts of consumption, and then the hike to survive. And it was impossible to believe this could have actually happened, and it did.
The survivors informed media from all over the world that they had stayed alive by consuming cheese and other food they brought along. And when those supplies were depleted, they turned to local plants. They intended to first share the true details of their survival, including the choice to eat the bodies of those who died, but only with their families. However, in Montevideo, false rumours quickly started to spread that they had killed some of the other survivors for food. On the 23rd of December, the same day that the last survivors were removed from the mountains, reports of cannibalism were released globally, except Uruguay. 3 days later, to the horror of millions, 2 photos were taken by members of the Andean Relief Corps, showing a half-eaten human leg, were featured on the front page of 2 leading Chilean newspapers, later making headlines all over the world. At first, the survivors encountered negative public opinion. However, once they clarified the agreement they had made to sacrifice their own flesh if they died to aid others in surviving, the public outcry diminished, and their families grew more sympathetic.
This included a telegram sanctioning the consumption from Pope Paul VI. And a little bit of aftermath. At the time of recording, 4 of the 16 survivors of the tragedy in the Andes have since passed away. Alvaro Mangino Schmid, one of the 16 people who survived, died in Montevideo just a day before turning 71 due to respiratory problems caused by pneumonia. Javier Meffel passed away on the 4th of June 2015 at the British Hospital in Montevideo at the age of 79 due to melanoma. Jose Luis Quincate passed away on Thursday the 27th of July 2023 at the age of 75 after a prolonged illness. Daniel Fernandez Strauch passed away in Montevideo on Thursday, May 9th, 2025 at the age of 79 after a long-term struggle with illness.
So yeah, since the story went public, obviously, if you're a family member and your loved one has been consumed, I imagine the reaction, seeing some people come back to their families and then learning that your son or your daughter, well, I think it was the sons, wasn't it? But that must be such a jarring process for the families to kind of come to terms with, knowing that, I mean, in one part, you're knowing that they've aided the survival of others, but then to know that happened to your loved one. I can understand the initial outcry, I suppose. It's a big bit of news to receive.
Yeah, it's hard to comprehend. I think when you read the headlines of this case, you think mountain snow cannibalism is the kind of order you think of it when you're hearing not much more about it. But when you look into it and look about, as I said, the camaraderie, the smart thinking of the team, how young they were, the fact that they said, they sacrificed themselves for one another, essentially. It takes a very small-minded person just to condemn them for what they did. They did what they needed to survive, and if it wasn't for those people making the ultimate sacrifice, then they wouldn't be there.
Yeah, completely agreed. I mean, in terms of the crash site or the survival site itself, it has Google Street View, a modern-day version of it, captured in March of 2022. There are public tours. I believe they're 4 days long, and most of it is completed on quad bikes and horseback. There are multiple monuments at the site. and memorial candles and things like that. There's been a museum made about this event itself, multiple films, books, even a theatre production. The most recent Google Street View, which we've popped up in the episode a few times, it shows tour guides at the scene, multiple dozens of hikers, horses for the hikers. There are literally mountains as far, although there's not as much snow now, there are mountains as far as the eye can see, very small amount of remaining fuselage, Uruguayan flags, framed photos of those lives that were lost, candles and religious symbols in glass boxes. I said that many of the survivors have done lots of books and interviews in the process. One of them actually sat down with Lad Bible, which I did not expect that collab to happen, but it's out there on YouTube. Yeah, that's kind of it in terms of modern day news on the case. Just an incredible, unbelievable story. And then Society of the Snow, I think in the last year or so, got added to Netflix, so it's available to stream now. I think Alive has been on there and then removed, but I think it's on Prime. But I think both films also collaborated with some of the survivors and got their insights in how to film certain scenes, and certain actors sat down with certain survivors. But yeah, just an unbelievable story, really. We've never covered a case like this. I don't feel like it's been a case that's similar to any cases we've covered before. Just a really harrowing one.
Definitely, yeah. It's one that I think you need to look at with the glasses of the case of survival, because it's a truly remarkable story how they managed to survive. But yeah, that is the case of the tragedy of the Andes. Now for a little bit of light relief, if we can, lookalikes. So mine is of Daniel Fernandez. It's not a great shout, but I thought I have to do it. Jordan Pickford. Pretty much just the haircut. I think it's not too bad, Dan. You think it's all right?
Yeah, it's all right, that, yeah.
I've got one for you then. I think that's pretty solid.
Fernandez's hands as well look quite big, so maybe he could be a goalkeeper as well.
Yeah. All right, I've gone for Nando Parrado, George Best in his prime.
The sideburns.
It's mainly the haircut and the sideburns, yeah.
Yeah. Or casual honky-tonk man.
Casual honky-tonk man is good, yeah.
Yeah, so we are absolutely zooming through the series. We have, after this, 4 cases left. We are going to need a little favour from you guys soon as well, regarding one of those cases. Yeah, it's been absolutely whirlwind of the cases we've been picking, but thank you so much for the support. All the new subscribers, it's lovely to see you guys. And if you haven't, then why not consider subscribing? It's very much appreciated. And if you guys just haven't had enough of true crime and us, then on the website we have way over 200 cases, over 220 cases even, for all of our minisodes. You can sign up for a small fee per month and get access to all of those. You can also access video on Spotify. So why not sign up?
Tom, I've got to correct you there, because you can actually sign up for free for 7 days.
What?
Absolutely free.
That sounds stupid.
You could binge the whole catalogue and then cancel if you want. But don't do that. Actually, no, we're not going to hold it against you if you do, but you can do that.
Bloody hell, I thought we outlawed all the freebies.
Sorry about that.
In the world of ICMAP. Come on in, create a free account, subscribe, and then you can have it for free. Maybe that's a fair trade-off.
Good idea.
But yes, before we go, I guess it's time for the old cryptic clue.
Flipping heck. It's that time.
Benjamin Carter's cryptic clues. Everyone gather round for some clues that can be quite cryptic, but he's going to give them to you anyway. Hope you can figure them out.
Wow. So, episode 9 of series 12. The cryptic clue for next week's episode is: today's case has had lots of them red. Today's case has had lots of them red, as in the colour red, by the way. I'm not going to do you that hard. I'm not going to do you that badly.
I didn't get it at first.
I don't think many people will, Dan. But there you go. As you said, like this case, Ben, in a way, peaks and troughs.
Yes.
Yes, again, thank you so much for your support, guys. We'll be back again with a brand new big case. And until then, like we always say,
we say this all the time.
Keep doing what you're doing.
Bloody hell. less and less and less and less and less and less.
Unless it's reclining your seat on an airplane, because you only gain like 2 inches and it's annoying for the person behind.
Incredibly annoying. Incredibly annoying. And if you're in the aisle seat, maybe consider snoozing too early, because or on a long haul, maybe just try and be conscious of the fact that most people need to piss and shit regularly. But anyway, thank you so much, guys. Until next time, take care of yourself.
See you later.
See you in a bit.